Now that you have set up principles, scope, and architecture capability in the preliminary phase, you are ready to move into architecture vision, which is where your architecture work becomes real for stakeholders. This phase is not about perfect models or detailed target states. It is about creating a shared understanding of why change is needed, what outcomes matter, and what direction the enterprise will commit to. If you do architecture vision well, you earn buy-in, reduce resistance, and create a foundation that makes later phases faster and less political. If you do it poorly, everything that follows becomes debate, delay, and rework. Building on that purpose, you should treat architecture vision as a leadership agreement, not a technical artifact. It is the point where you align business leaders, technology leaders, security and risk stakeholders, and delivery teams around a common story of change. The vision defines the scope of change, the value to be delivered, the major constraints, and the success measures that will be used to judge progress. It also sets expectations about governance, decision rights, and how trade-offs will be handled. In real organizations, architecture vision is often the difference between a transformation that is supported and a transformation that is tolerated. Your job is to turn "we should modernize" into "we agree on outcomes, we agree on direction, and we agree on how we will govern delivery." With the vision framed as an agreement, you begin by clarifying what triggered the architecture work and why it cannot be ignored. The trigger might be rising operational incidents, growing cyber risk, increasing customer dissatisfaction, rising costs from duplicated platforms, or a strategic shift such as new markets or new regulatory expectations. You need to articulate the burning platform calmly and credibly, without exaggeration. Leaders do not need fear, they need clarity. When you define the trigger well, you create urgency that is rational, and you prevent the program from becoming a nice to have that loses priority the moment budgets tighten. Now that the trigger is clear, you need stakeholder clarity because buy-in is not a generic concept. In enterprise work, there are stakeholders who fund, stakeholders who approve risk, stakeholders who operate systems, and stakeholders who deliver change. Each group has different concerns, and if you treat them all the same, you will lose support. You identify who has decision authority, who has veto power, and who will be accountable for outcomes. You also identify who will be impacted operationally, because operational impact is where resistance often hides. When you map stakeholders properly, you stop guessing and start managing buy-in as a structured leadership activity. With stakeholders identified, you need to communicate in a way that earns trust. Most stakeholders do not reject architecture because they dislike architecture. They reject it because it sounds abstract or disconnected from their pressures. You build buy-in by speaking in outcomes: reduced risk, reduced rework, faster delivery, improved resilience, improved customer experience, predictable cost, and clearer accountability. You translate architecture direction into business and operational impact, such as fewer outages, faster onboarding, and faster incident response. When you communicate this way, architecture becomes a tool that helps stakeholders meet their goals, not a parallel activity that competes for attention. Now that you are speaking the stakeholder language, you need to define business outcomes that can be measured and delivered. Business outcomes should be specific enough that you can track progress, but not so narrow that they become a single team metric. For example, instead of saying modernize platforms, you define outcomes such as reducing customer onboarding time, reducing operational incidents caused by integration failures, improving audit readiness through consistent logging, or reducing technology duplication across business units. When outcomes are measurable, leaders can fund with confidence and delivery teams can align their work to a clear finish line. This is a critical part of Phase A because it turns ambition into accountability. With outcomes defined, you need a value case that connect those outcomes to investment logic. A value case is not only about financial return, it is about why this change matters now compared to other competing priorities. Your value case should address value creation such as improved customer retention, faster time to market, and reduced operational costs. And it should also address value protection such as reduced cyber risk, reduced regulatory exposure, and reduced outage impact. Leaders often fund change because they want to avoid future pain as much as they want future gains. Your role is to make both sides visible so the organization understands what it is buying and what it is avoiding. Now that the value case is clear, you must define constraints and non-negotiables early because vision fails when it ignores reality. Constraints might include regulatory obligations, security requirements, operational availability expectations, budget limits, vendor contracts, or limited change capacity. Non-negotiables might include identity and access standards, data protection requirements, monitoring and logging expectations, and resilience targets for critical services. By naming constraints and non-negotiables, you reduce later conflict and prevent unrealistic designs. You also demonstrate credibility because stakeholders see you are not selling a fantasy. This is how Phase A creates confidence. It tells the truth about what must be respected. With constraints clarified, you need scope discipline because ambition without scope becomes failure. Scope is the boundary of what the architecture work will cover, such as which value streams, which capabilities, which platforms, and which business units are included. You also define what is explicitly out of scope, at least for the current cycle, so stakeholders do not assume everything will be fixed at once. Scope clarity helps delivery teams plan and helps leaders understand what will be achieved within the time frame and budget. It also prevents the program from becoming a dumping ground for unrelated issues. In Phase A, scope is your protection against endless expansion. Now that scope is clear, you need to produce a small set of deliverables that make the vision usable. You produce a concise architecture vision statement that describes the target direction and why it matters. You create a high-level baseline and target view that shows the shift from current pain to future direction without unnecessary technical depth. You define principles and key requirements that apply to the work. You produce a stakeholder and communication plan so alignment is sustained. And you outline an initial roadmap direction, not as a detailed plan, but as a credible path that shows how the organization could move forward. These deliverables are not paperwork. They are the minimum evidence required for leaders to approve direction and for teams to begin aligned work. With deliverables in place, you need to address trade-offs because every architecture vision contains conflict. Some stakeholders want speed, others want control. Some want standardization, others want local autonomy. Some want cost savings, others want resilience investment. If you ignore these trade-offs, they will resurface later as program delays and political fights. In Phase A, you bring trade-offs into the open and frame them as conscious choices. You clarify what will be standardized and what will remain flexible. You clarify what risks are acceptable and what risks are not. This is one of your most valuable leadership contributions because you convert hidden conflict into managed decision making. Now that you understand the mechanics, imagine you are creating an architecture vision for a customer digital modernization program. The trigger is poor customer experience, slow onboarding, and rising service costs due to manual processes. Your stakeholders include business leaders who own customer outcomes, technology leaders who own platforms, security stakeholders who own risk, and operations teams who own stability. You define outcomes such as reducing onboarding time, improving service reliability, and enabling consistent customer identity across channels. You build a value case that combines improved customer retention with reduced operational cost and reduced security exposure. You define constraints such as regulatory obligations and operational availability targets. You set scope around the onboarding and service request value streams first, rather than trying to rebuild every customer system at once. You produce a vision that commits to a shared customer identity approach, a standard integration direction, and strong monitoring expectations. This vision becomes a shared contract that guides later architecture and delivery decisions. Building on the customer example, consider a security and compliance uplift where the trigger is audit findings and inconsistent control implementation across environments. Stakeholders include risk and compliance leaders, security operations, platform teams, and delivery teams. You define outcomes such as consistent logging for investigation, improved identity and access control, reduced configuration drift, and improved audit readiness. The value case includes risk reduction and reduced cost of remediation after incidents. Constraints include retention requirements and operational availability. Scope might focus first on critical systems and shared platforms, then expand in later cycles. The vision sets non-negotiables such as identity and access standards, logging baselines, and exception handling. By defining this clearly in phase A, you avoid later resistance because the enterprise agreed upfront on what is required and why. Now that the vision is shaped, you need to secure approval in a way that creates commitment rather than passive acceptance. Commitment happens when leaders agree on outcomes, scope, constraints, and governance, and when they accept the trade-offs required. You make approval easier by showing that the vision is realistic, that the value case is credible, and that the risks are understood. You also clarify what decisions are being requested now and what decisions will be requested later. This prevents the common failure where leaders feel ambushed by decisions they did not expect. In phase A, your goal is to gain explicit sponsorship and a mandate to proceed. Because without that mandate, the rest of the architecture development method cycle becomes advisory and slow. With approval achieved, you need momentum because many organizations create a vision and then lose energy. You prevent this by translating vision into immediate next steps, such as confirming governance cadence, confirming key requirements, and initiating the next phase work with clear stakeholder engagement. You also keep the vision visible through consistent narrative and reporting, so teams do not drift into local optimization. Momentum also depends on quick wins that demonstrate the vision is not just talk, such as providing reusable patterns, clarifying standards, and resolving early design conflicts. This is how the vision becomes lived reality rather than a document that fades after the kickoff meeting. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can apply it immediately. You learned that architecture vision in phase A is a leadership agreement that aligns stakeholders on why change is needed, what outcomes matter, and what direction the enterprise will commit to. You learn to start by clarifying the trigger and burning platform in a credible, calm way that creates rational urgency. You learn that stakeholder buy-in requires knowing who funds, who approves risk, who operates, and who delivers, and tailoring your message to each group. You learned how to define measurable business outcomes and build a value case that includes both value creation and value protection. You learn to define constraints, non-negotiables, and scope early to keep the vision realistic and executable. You learn to produce a small set of vision deliverables that provide the minimum evidence needed for approval and alignment. You learn to surface trade-offs early so they do not become political fights later. Finally, you learned how to secure commitment and maintain momentum so the vision becomes the foundation for the rest of the architecture development method cycle. Now that you know how to run phase A architecture vision as a practical leadership activity, you are ready to create visions that earn buy-in and drive real outcomes instead of becoming presentation material. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with your architecture and delivery peers, and comment with the most difficult stakeholder group you usually face when trying to build architecture buy-in, and what makes it challenging in your organization.